Hello guys, welcome back to another video. Today is June 30th, 2020. I am Chase Talks Politics. In this episode, we are going to be discussing Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about if it will become a state and what impact it would have on elections. So basically, the situation with Washington, D.C. right now is they did get the House vote on June 26th, which the House is controlled by Democrats, but they got the House vote, so now it goes to the Republican-controlled Senate, which it is not very likely to get passed through in the Senate, but the big chance that the Democrats would have for Washington, D.C. to become a state would be if the Democrats can take control of the Senate in the election, and then that would be a good chance for D.C. to have statehood. So this has been talked about for a while, but this is the first time that Washington, D.C. has actually had their statehood approved by the U.S. House. So it is not yet that Washington, D.C. will officially become a state. They still have to get the Senate vote, but this is a big thing that just went down. So D.C. statehood approved by U.S. House for the first time in history. This is from the Washington Post. For the first time since the establishment of the District of Columbia 230 years ago, the House of Representatives voted to declare the city to be the nation's 51st state, a legislative milestone that supporters say begins to right historical wrongs. The vote on Wednesday afternoon, which fell mostly along party lines, comes as the United States grapples with systemic racism that officials in the nation's capital say has led to the disenfranchisement of the 700,000 residents. The White House confirmed Tuesday that it opposes statehood, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said he will not bring the legislation to a vote in his Republican-controlled chamber. But that did not stop the celebration by statehood advocates and D.C. officials who have pushed for passage of the legislation for years. A video tweeted by the office of D.C. Mayor Muriel E. Bowser, who watched the proceedings with aides and statehood supporters at a restaurant on the southwest waterfront, showed her waving her hands above her head during the vote. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and statehood is our demand, the fifth-generation Washington said in a statement, referencing a famous quote from abolitionist and one-time D.C. Resident Frederick Douglass. She added, "I was born without representation, but I swear I will not die without representation. Together we will achieve D.C. statehood, and when we do, we will look back on this day and remember all who stood with us on the right side of history." Eleanor Holmes Norton, Democrat who has served as the district's non-voting representative in Congress for nearly 3 decades, managed the bill for Democrats on the floor, doling out time for lawmakers from her party to speak and rebutting Republican arguments against statehood. In an interview, she said the experience was a thrill. Every member got to vote on D.C. statehood except the member who represents the District of Columbia. We're close to putting an end to this kind of anomaly. The House voted on D.C. statehood once before in 1993 when the bill failed 277 to 153. This time the legislation has 227 co-sponsors, a majority in the House. It passed 232 to 180 last week, with 19 members not voting. The lone Democrat to oppose the bill was Rep. Colin C. Peterson, whose Minnesota district heavily favored President Trump in 2016. A companion bill in the Senate is co-sponsored by 39 Democrats and Bernie Sanders. D.C. statehood has become a civil rights litmus test for the Democrats' party's left flank, partly because the city once a majority African-American one and home to historically black Howard University and a rich tradition of black music from jazz to go-go, still has a population that is 46% African-American. Skip down a little bit here. Her bill, H.R. 51, this is what it's called, would shrink the seat of the federal government to a 2-square-mile enclave, including the White House, Capitol Hill, the Supreme Court, and other federal buildings, which were made under congressional control. Even if Democrats take control of the Senate, they would need 60 votes for the bill to overcome a likely filibuster. Okay, so in the Senate, they're going to need 60 votes in order for D.C. to become a state. So my thoughts on D.C. potentially becoming a state. I would say right now, I don't think D.C. will become a state in a Republican-controlled Senate. I don't think there's any chance they get 60 votes. We'll look at why I don't think so right now. But if I had to predict, I don't think D.C. will become a state, sadly. But I think in the future that they definitely have a chance. So let's look at Let's look at senators that approve of DC becoming a state. We're going to look at who approves and who disapproves. Let me just pull that up right now. Senate supporters of DC statehood bill. Here we go. So here's the Senate supporters of DC statehood bill. So they need 60 votes. Right now, 33 Democrats want DC to become a state. 14 Democrats don't want DC to become a state, and 53 Republicans don't want DC to become a state. So the Democrats, they can't afford to just get majority, which would be 51. They actually need 60 because of the filibuster, which I'll probably make another video about that in the future because it's a difficult topic. But they need 60 votes. So right now they're at 33. They have 33 guaranteed votes from senators who approve DC becoming a state as of April 2019. So right now that would only be 33. But if somehow they can convince 14 Democrats who don't want DC to become a state to vote for it to become a state, that's still only 47. So they would need 13 more. So that would have to come from Republican voters. So that's probably not going to happen. They would need 13 Republican votes at best. And they probably won't even get all the Republicans. So they're looking at like 7 or 8 Democrats that they're going to have to convince, plus 13 Republicans. So even if they can convince those Democrats who aren't so sure about DC becoming a state to vote yes, they're still going to need 13 Republicans to vote yes. So I think the best scenario for the Democrats would be if they can control the Senate. If they are able to win the Senate back so the Senate is controlled by Republicans. That's why if the Senate was controlled by Democrats, they would have a better shot at this. But they won the House vote because it was controlled by Democrats. Now they have to take back the Senate, which is controlled by Republicans, to get DC to become a state. So that's why the best scenario, because the Republicans are obviously going to vote no, so it won't become a state this year. But let's say that the Democrats, this election is going to be so important in the Senate, because if the Democrats can take back the Senate, then they can most likely, if they can get enough to win, then let's say they get 51 to, let's say they get the majority, then they have a realistic shot at DC becoming a state if they don't have a Republican majority. So the best shot, I would give you, there's about a 3% chance right now that DC becomes a state right now. But if the Democrats win the Senate election and they get majority, then we're looking at something realistic because you wouldn't need as many Republican votes. But even then, so I don't think DC is becoming a state anytime soon, but I would love for it to happen. Same with Puerto Rico. But another scenario, which again probably won't happen, is DC could become a state. They could combine with Maryland or Virginia. So let's look at that. Let's bring up this map right here. So right now in presidential elections, DC, right here as you can see, is worth 3 votes. Virginia is worth 13 votes, and Virginia is, pretty safe Democrat. So if Virginia, though, and DC, they're both opposed to becoming a state together. Virginia, for DC to become a state along with Virginia. But if Virginia and DC became a state together, that's 16 electoral votes, so that would be a little bit more. If we look at Maryland, which is another Democratic state, DC and Maryland are both opposed to becoming a state together, but let's say it happened, that would be 13 votes. So that would be, some more safe states for the Democrats. Let's look at an interactive map here. So ignore the D.C. part right here. In Virginia, let's pretend it's 16 and Maryland's 13. So this isn't for this election, because obviously D.C. is most likely not going to become a state by this year's election on November 3rd. So let's look at if D.C. became a state along with Virginia, which, could happen, but I'm hearing it's most likely not. So that would be 16 votes for the Democrats. So that would be some more safe votes for the Democrats. And it would be 3 more votes if D.C. became a state with Maryland. So D.C. would help the Democrats in the election because it would give them more safe votes. If D.C. became a state, it would still be worth the same, if D.C. became a state by itself. But if it became a state with Maryland or Virginia, then it would just be more, it would give more help to the Democrats in future elections because it would just be more safe delegates. So yeah, my opinion overall, I don't think D.C. is going to become a state. I don't think they'll get past the Republican Senate. But if the Democrats don't win the Senate in this November, then they're not going to get D.C. a state. But if they can get the majority, then they have a shot at getting D.C. a state. So thank you guys for watching. Leave suggestions below, and I'll see you all tonight.